At 3:47 in the morning, the sound of jet engines shattered the night sky above Doha. Israeli F-35s pierced the darkness, unleashing precision strikes on a communications hub. Windows splintered, children woke in terror, smoke curled into the dawn. What began as another Middle Eastern headline did not stay contained within the Gulf. It sent tremors all the way to Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. For some, this was simply a clash of powers far away. But for Africans, it carried the weight of memory. The sound of missiles was the sound of history repeating itself, the same story of foreign powers deciding the fate of others. And in that hour, one of Africa's youngest leaders refused to remain silent. Ibrahim Traoré lifted the phone and declared directly to Benjamin Netanyahu, "Africa will not stay silent." It was not a threat. It was not rhetoric. It was the opening shot in a contest that would shake continents. Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe, share, and walk with us as we uncover how one small nation's defiance echoed across the globe. At 3:47 in the morning, the silence of Doha was split open by a roar that belonged not to the desert winds, but to machines of war. Israeli F-35 fighters streaked through the Gulf sky, dropping missiles with clinical precision. The target was a communications hub on the edge of the city. Within seconds, steel and concrete turned into dust. Windows shattered in surrounding neighborhoods. Mothers clutched their children. A city that had fallen asleep in peace was now awake in terror. Israel's statement came swiftly. This was a counter-terrorism strike, a preemptive defense. Yet to millions listening to the first radio broadcast that morning, the truth sounded far simpler. A sovereign state had been attacked without warning. Across the Middle East, analysts debated motives. In Africa, the reaction was more visceral. In marketplaces, in tea stalls, in mosques, and in buses, the memory of similar nights returned. The nights when foreign aircraft had bombed African towns under the banner of counterterrorism, humanitarian intervention, or resource protection. Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, awoke to the news like a man startled from a recurring nightmare. For decades, the continent had endured the feeling that its sovereignty could be violated at will. And now, watching the flames rising above Doha, many Africans whispered the same words. Today, Qatar. Tomorrow, us. In the presidential residence of Ouagadougou, Ibrahim Traoré sat not as a passive spectator, but as a man who had carried the weight of his country's struggle. At just over 30 years old, he had already become a symbol of defiance, inheriting the memory of Thomas Sankara and the longing for dignity. That morning, he chose not to wait for statements drafted by diplomats in New York or Brussels. He picked up the phone and called Benjamin Netanyahu directly. His words were calm, deliberate, but unyielding. "Your aircraft crossed a line. Africa will not stay silent." That moment marked the pivot. It was not an African leader echoing someone else's script. It was Africa speaking in its own voice. Within hours, the ripples began to spread. Radio presenters repeated Traoré's sentence with urgency. Market traders whispered it to each other. WhatsApp groups buzzed with fragments of his words. And by midday, the phrase had leapt from Ouagadougou to Lagos, from Accra to Johannesburg. Israel had calculated that Qatar's silence would be manageable. It had not calculated that Africa's voice would rise in unison. In Tel Aviv, defense contractors began to frown at their screens. Billions of dollars worth of contracts tied to surveillance drones, training missions, and weapons sales suddenly looked precarious. Within 24 hours, the so-called minor state of Burkina Faso had forced one of the most powerful militaries in the Middle East to reconsider its assumptions. Yet the story was not only about contracts or diplomatic cables. It was about memory, the scar that every African carried. For an old miner named Adama, north of Ouagadougou, the headline felt like an echo of his own life. He had seen foreign soldiers march through his country in the name of security. He had dug gold from the earth while foreign corporations grew rich. His lungs were filled with dust, his hands calloused. When the announcer declared that Israel had struck Qatar, he turned to his wife and whispered, "They test Qatar today. Tomorrow they test us." For him, Traoré's voice was not mere politics. It was survival. By nightfall, the continent felt the tremor. Not because tanks rolled, not because armies moved, but because a sentence had been spoken that refused to bow, and the world had heard it. But what came next was bigger than Tel Aviv ever imagined. The tremors that began in Ouagadougou soon grew into shockwaves. Within 6 hours of Ibrahim Traoré's phone call to Netanyahu, African capitals lit up with emergency consultations. Within 12 hours, Israel's embassy lines were clogged with frantic requests for clarification. By the 24th hour, defense analysts in Tel Aviv were scribbling notes about losses that could rise into billions. In Accra, members of Ghana's parliament raised their voices in heated debate, demanding the suspension of Israeli military cooperation. In Abuja, the president of Nigeria rejected Netanyahu's call altogether, signaling that this was no longer an isolated protest, but the emergence of a continental front. In Johannesburg, elderly callers to late-night radio programs recalled the dark days of apartheid, reminding listeners that silence in the face of aggression had once sustained injustice. This time they vowed Africa would not be silent. The atmosphere was electric. In Bamako, teenagers spray-painted the words "Africa bows to no one" on crumbling concrete walls. In Nairobi, women's associations marched with banners declaring sovereignty sacred. Taxi drivers in Lagos tuned in to radio hosts dissecting Traore's statement, callers demanding that their leaders follow his example. For the first time in decades, the continent did not feel like a chorus of fragmented voices. It felt like a roar. Tel Aviv had grown accustomed to muted responses from the global south. A carefully worded apology, a few statements of concern, and then the world would move on. But this time the script broke. Israel's ambassador in Ouagadougou urgently requested an audience with Traore. The young leader's reply was curt and cutting. The only misunderstanding is Israel thinking Africa will remain silent when sovereignty is trampled. The symbolism was devastating. In the eyes of many Africans, this was not merely about Israel and Qatar. It was about dignity. A small landlocked nation had stood upright against a state armed with nuclear weapons and backed by Washington. The parallel to David and Goliath was irresistible. Except this time, David was not a single shepherd with a stone. David was an entire continent, bound by shared wounds and a collective refusal to be sidelined. Adama, the old miner, captured the paradox in words that echoed far beyond his modest home. Be proud your president spoke, but be ready. They killed Lumumba. They killed Sankara. They killed Gaddafi. They may try to kill him too. His warning resonated with millions. Hope and fear mingled in equal measure. Pride that Africa had finally found its voice, dread that the price of courage was often blood. International media scrambled to interpret what was unfolding. Some analysts dismissed Traoré as reckless, predicting that Burkina Faso would isolate itself and collapse under economic pressure. Others, however, described him as a revolutionary, a leader who had revived the spirit of Thomas Sankara. European news anchors speculated on whether Africa's sudden unity could withstand the familiar temptations of aid and trade offered as leverage by Western powers. Yet the clearest reaction came from the streets. In Cairo, protesters waved both Qatari and African flags. In Cape Town, chants echoed in multiple languages but carried the same message: our land, our right, our future. Social media amplified the story, bridging the continent with diaspora communities in London, Paris, and New York. In Harlem, activists invoked Martin Luther King Jr., linking their struggle for justice to Africa's defiance. Israel found itself cornered not only diplomatically, but also morally. Netanyahu, long confident of unconditional Western support, faced something he had not prepared for: the moral authority of a united continent. For the first time in decades, Africa was not reacting as a bystander to someone else's war. It was shaping the global response. And then, as if to crown the moment, the African Union prepared an emergency summit. Leaders from 54 nations cleared their schedules, boarding planes and driving through dangerous roads to Addis Ababa. The hall filled with whispers of history being written. The question was no longer whether Africa would respond. The question was how far it would go. And then, the African Union made a decision that stunned the world. The African Union summit in Addis Ababa unfolded with an intensity rarely seen in its marble halls. Delegates from across the continent rose one after another, not with the usual diplomatic caution, but with conviction sharpened by decades of humiliation. Algeria closed its airspace. South Africa suspended relations. Nigeria terminated defense contracts. Within hours, what had once taken months of negotiation became unanimous. Sanctions against Israel, the suspension of diplomatic privileges, and a demand for accountability at the United Nations. The decision reverberated far beyond the chamber. For ordinary Africans, it was more than a political act. It was a reclaiming of dignity. In Ouagadougou, students poured out of university gates with hand-painted placards: Qatar today, Africa tomorrow. In Lagos, callers flooded late-night radio shows, demanding their leaders mirror Traoré's stance. In Nairobi, women's groups carried banners that read, "Sovereignty is sacred." It was not the language of governments alone. It was the language of the people. Yet pride was tempered with apprehension. In Bamako, crowds spoke Traore's name with reverence, likening him to Sankara reborn. But older voices remembered how history had dealt with Africa's visionaries. Patrice Lumumba's body hidden in acid, Thomas Sankara's blood staining the streets of Ouagadougou, Muammar Gaddafi dragged through the dust. Each name was a reminder that courage often carried a fatal price. Adama, the old miner, summed it up for his grandson. Be proud, but be ready. Inside Burkina Faso itself, the consequences were immediate. Military cooperation with Israel was suspended. Intelligence sharing agreements were terminated. Training programs halted. The Israeli ambassador was left pleading for an audience that never came. Instead, Traore addressed his cabinet with blunt clarity. The misunderstanding is theirs, believing Africa will remain silent when sovereignty is violated. His words crystallized what millions had already felt. But beyond the symbolism, practical questions emerged. How would the continent withstand the economic pressures that were certain to follow? Would Western aid be withheld? Would contracts be dangled as bait to lure governments back into submission? And if so, would Africa hold firm or fracture under the familiar weight of division? For now, the sense of unity remained strong. Social media pulsed with messages of solidarity, spreading from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Diaspora communities rallied in European capitals, their chants linking the fate of Africa to the struggles of oppressed peoples everywhere. What might once have been dismissed as rhetoric was now shaping markets and rattling governments. Tel Aviv's stock exchange dipped, analysts openly admitting that Africa's voice had been underestimated. In this crucible of defiance, Traore's leadership came to embody more than the politics of Burkina Faso. To many, it was nothing less than the beginning of a continental awakening, a political earthquake that some commentators referred to as an Ibrahim Traoré coup, not in the narrow sense of seizing power by force, but in the broader sense of overturning the old order where Africa remained silent and submissive. For the first time in a generation, the continent was not waiting for others to act. It was setting the terms. This defiance carried risks. Washington and Brussels began drafting measures of economic pressure. Intelligence whispers suggested that Israel was recalibrating its strategy, seeking to exploit old rivalries within Africa. And yet, for ordinary citizens, the sense of empowerment outweighed the fear. In marketplaces, bus stations, mosques, and churches, the refrain was the same. Africa had spoken, and it would not return to silence. The political consequences were already rippling outward. International summits that once ignored African delegations now faced a new calculus. Votes at the United Nations suddenly carried more weight. Contracts for minerals, oil, and agriculture were being reconsidered in light of shifting alliances. Africa was no longer the passive stage for global actors. It was emerging as the actor itself. Still, one question lingered, like a shadow across the continent. Could this unity endure? Would the lure of contracts, the pressure of sanctions, or the fear of retaliation divide Africa once more? The continent had known betrayal before, betrayal from without and betrayal from within. This time, many prayed would be different. But Africa's stand was not just about itself. The world was watching, and the reactions from beyond the continent would prove decisive. Beyond Africa, the shock of Traoré's defiance was felt in every diplomatic corridor. In Washington, the National Security Council convened an emergency session. Intelligence briefings warned that Africa was no longer following, it was leading. The Pentagon grew anxious, not only about votes at the United Nations, but also about the minerals and resources that underpin global supply chains. From cobalt in the Congo to uranium in Niger, Africa's commodities had become essential to Western industries. If redirected, they could reshape the balance of power. The American ambassador in Ouagadougou met Traoré in a tense exchange. She insisted that his condemnation was destabilizing. Calm but firm, Traoré replied, "It was not our words that destabilized the region. It was Israel's strike. Our response restores balance." His bluntness unsettled Washington more than silence ever could. Europe, too, scrambled. Paris, once confident in its grip on Francophone Africa, discovered its calls ignored. Brussels attempted to mediate, appealing for balance, but Africa no longer sought European approval. Even London, a former empire that had once commanded vast influence, could do little more than watch as African leaders spoke in a unified voice. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the reaction was transformative. The Arab League, emboldened by Africa's stand, invited Traore to address its emergency summit in Cairo. As he walked to the podium in fatigues rather than a tailored suit, applause erupted. His words were simple yet thunderous. Qatar stood with Africa when others looked away. Today, Africa stands with Qatar. Sovereignty is not a gift from the powerful. It is the birthright of every nation. Broadcast live from Cairo to Casablanca, his speech electrified millions. The symbolism was profound. For decades, the Middle East had viewed Africa as a junior partner, a recipient of aid, a source of resources. Now it witnessed a continent claiming its place as an equal. Commentators across the Arab world hailed it as a turning point, while leaders in Iran and Turkey praised Traore for doing what they themselves had often hesitated to do: challenge Israel directly. Across the global south, the momentum spread. In Latin America, newspapers drew parallels between Africa's defiance and their own struggles against Western dominance. In Asia, commentators pointed to a new alignment taking shape. The phrase that began circulating online was unmistakable: Burkina Faso revolution. Not a revolution of arms, but a revolution of dignity, sovereignty, and defiance. For Tel Aviv, the crisis had shifted beyond economics. It was no longer about contracts or deals lost. It was about legitimacy. Israel had underestimated Africa, and now the world was listening. The question was no longer about Israel. It was about Africa's future and whether the continent could withstand the storms gathering against it. As the dust settled over Doha, the true test was only beginning. Africa's unity had shaken Tel Aviv, rattled Washington, and captured the imagination of the global South. But could that unity endure once the weight of sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and covert interference descended upon the continent? History had shown how fragile solidarity could be when confronted with the temptations of aid, the lure of contracts, and the threat of isolation. The choices before Africa were stark. On one hand, the continent could retreat into familiar divisions, allowing external powers to exploit rivalries and dilute the spirit of defiance. On the other, it could chart a new course, one in which sovereignty was defended not as a slogan, but as a guiding principle of governance, diplomacy, and trade. For the first time in decades, Africa was not reacting to others' wars. It was shaping the future of its own. Ibrahim Traoré's words in Addis Ababa still hung in the air. Africa is no longer the background of other people's wars. From this day, we are the front line of sovereignty. Those words, echoed in classrooms, parliaments, and marketplaces, offered both hope and a heavy responsibility. To remain united, African leaders would need to resist not only external pressure, but also internal betrayal, the very pattern that had undone movements in the past. Economically, the stakes were enormous. Africa supplied the cobalt that powered smartphones, the uranium that fueled nuclear reactors, the oil that kept economies running. If these resources were leveraged collectively, the continent could redefine its role in global trade. But if they were fragmented and bargained away, the promise of sovereignty could dissolve into yet another chapter of exploitation. Culturally and politically, a sense of awakening spread. Young Africans began to see their leaders not as passive negotiators, but as actors in history. From the graffiti on city walls to the slogans in protest marches, the message was consistent. Dignity was non-negotiable. For the first time in a generation, Africans were not whispering about sovereignty. They were shouting it. Still, shadows loomed. Threats against Traoré's life were whispered in diplomatic corridors, reminders of how quickly defiant leaders had been silenced before. The memory of Lumumba, Sankara, and Gaddafi was invoked not only as inspiration, but also as warning. Yet even this fear seemed to strengthen rather than weaken the people's resolve. Candlelight vigils outside the presidential palace in Ouagadougou testified to a loyalty deeper than politics. It was the defense of an idea. The road ahead was uncertain. Would Africa stand firm under pressure? Would its leaders hold the line when promised billions in aid or threatened with sanctions? Or would history repeat itself as it had so many times before? The test was never Israel's strike. It was Africa's defiance, and the world was waiting to see if the flame would endure or be extinguished. The night sky above Doha had long cleared, but its echoes still rumbled across continents. What began as a single strike had become a turning point, not because of Israel's planes, but because of Africa's voice. In Ouagadougou, a young leader in fatigues reminded the world that sovereignty is not a privilege to be granted. It is a birthright to be defended. His defiance carried the memory of martyrs like Lumumba, Sankara, and Gaddafi, but it also carried the promise of a generation that refused to bow. The story of this moment is not only about geopolitics. It is about dignity, the conviction that even a landlocked nation dismissed as poor and powerless can alter the balance of global power when it dares to act with courage. This was not merely a reaction, it was a declaration, one that will be remembered as a spark in what some now call the Burkina Faso revolution. For Israel, the loss was not just economic, it was moral. It miscalculated, assuming that Africa's silence was permanent. For Washington and Brussels, the lesson was equally stark. Africa no longer waits for permission to speak. For Africans themselves, the lesson was transformative. Their voices matter, and when raised in unison, they can no longer be ignored. In the days that followed, some analysts described the moment as an Ibrahim Traoré coup, not the overthrow of a government, but the overthrow of an old world order where Africa remained a silent spectator. In truth, it was something larger. It was a reminder that power in the 21st century is not measured only in missiles and money, but in legitimacy, in solidarity, and in the courage to say no when sovereignty is trampled. The question now hangs heavy. Can Africa sustain this unity in the face of pressure, bribery, and intimidation? Can it defend the dignity that was so boldly proclaimed? History has warned of betrayals and setbacks, but for now, the flame burns brightly. And so the voice of Africa rises. Not charity, not pity, but sovereignty. If your heart beats for freedom, do not let it fade. Subscribe, comment, and share this story. For the struggle of sovereignty belongs to all who believe dignity is stronger than bombs.